The moment my granddaughter Taylor rolled her eyes and muttered, "Okay, boomer," under her breath, I knew something fundamental had shifted between us. It wasn't the first time my grandchildren had dismissed my advice as old-fashioned. It wasn't even the rudest comment I'd endured during our monthly family dinners. But something about the casual disrespect, delivered with such confidence as I offered to help with her mounting credit card debt, struck a chord deep within me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 74 years old, I'd built a life through decades of careful decisions, hard work, and financial discipline. My late husband Edward and I had transformed his small accounting practice into a regional firm that now employed over 30 people, creating a legacy worth over $3 million. We'd raised 2 children, helped fund 4 grandchildren's educations, and still managed to retire comfortably in our cherished Victorian home in Mapleton. Never once did we flaunt our success or expect gratitude, but neither did we expect to be treated as irrelevant relics by the very people we'd helped establish in life. "Grandma Martha doesn't understand how things work nowadays," my granddaughter Sophie would tell her mother, my daughter Claire, loud enough for me to hear. "Nobody saves for things anymore. We finance experiences. That's how our generation lives." I'd smile politely, sip my tea, and say nothing as they discussed my outdated views on money, technology, and life in general. After all, what did a widow who'd built a successful business, invested wisely through bull and bear markets, and paid for college educations know about financial responsibility? The old-fashioned comments had started about 2 years ago, around the time I began questioning why my grandchildren only seemed to visit when they needed financial assistance. Taylor's car repairs, Sophie's rent when she'd spent her money on festival tickets, Madison's unexpected emergency that somehow always coincided with the latest iPhone release, and even Braden's business ventures that never quite materialized, despite multiple rounds of "just a small investment to get things going, Grandma." Throughout it all, I maintained my composure, remembering my own grandmother's words. "Your reaction to disrespect says more about your character than their behavior. Says about theirs." So I'd smile, sometimes open my checkbook, and continue showing up at family gatherings where I increasingly felt like an ATM with homemade cookies rather than the family matriarch. My son David and his wife Margaret had raised Braden and Madison in a household of relative modesty. David had chosen to become a high school history teacher rather than join the family business, a decision Edward and I had supported wholeheartedly. Their children had summer jobs, worked through college, and still found time to visit regularly, though these visits too had begun to center around financial situations they needed help navigating. Claire and her husband Jeremy had taken a different approach with Taylor and Sophie. Jeremy's success in commercial real estate had afforded them a lifestyle of luxury, and they'd raised their children to expect the best of everything. Designer clothes, European vacations, and private schools had been their normal. Claire had always brushed off my gentle suggestions about teaching financial responsibility. "Mom," she would say with that dismissive laugh, "we want them to focus on building connections and experiences. That's how you get ahead today, not by pinching pennies like you and Dad did." The penny pinching she referred to had built the very wealth she now seemed to take for granted, a fact that didn't escape my notice but rarely seemed worth mentioning. The OK Boomer incident happened on a Sunday in late October. We had gathered at my home for our monthly family dinner, a tradition I'd maintained since Edward passed away 5 years earlier. I'd spent the day preparing everyone's favorites: pot roast with rosemary potatoes, homemade rolls, and my famous apple crumble. The dining room table gleamed with Edward's grandmother's china and the sterling silver candlesticks we'd received as wedding gifts nearly 50 years ago. Taylor arrived late, as usual, her attention immediately focused on her phone rather than the family members who'd been waiting to begin the meal. When she finally took her seat, she launched into a story about her recent weekend in Vegas, detailing the exclusive clubs and expensive bottles of champagne. The connections I made there are going to be game changers for my influencer brand, she explained, glancing around the table with self-importance. That sounds exciting, I offered, passing the potatoes. Though I hope you're setting aside enough for your credit card payment this month. Last time you mentioned you were carrying quite a balance. The table fell silent. Taylor's expression shifted from surprise to annoyance. That's not really how it works anymore, Grandma, she said with a patronizing smile. Debt is just a tool. Everyone leverages credit these days to build their personal brand and lifestyle. Perhaps, I responded carefully, but interest compounds. Whether you believe in traditional financial principles or not, I'd be happy to help you create a budget that's when it happened. The eye roll, followed by the dismissive, "Okay, boomer," muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear, followed by scattered uncomfortable laughter. Claire jumped in quickly. Mom, Taylor has a business degree. Financial planning works differently for millennials than it did in your day. I nodded and turned the conversation to Madison's new job, but something had crystallized in my mind. As I looked around at my family, enjoying the meal I'd prepared in my home, built with the wealth created through the very principles they dismissed, I realized I had been enabling a pattern of disrespect that went beyond generational differences. That night, after everyone had left, I sat in Edward's old leather chair in my study, surrounded by photographs chronicling our family's history. I picked up a picture of Edward and me on the day we'd signed the papers to buy our first office building. We were young, terrified, and exhilarated, having scraped together everything we had for the down payment. What would you do? I asked his smiling image. The answer came with surprising clarity, as though he were sitting across from me rather than gone these past 5 years. It was time to be generous in a different way, one that might actually help rather than harm the people I loved most. The D. Following morning, I called my attorney, Miriam Stevens, and scheduled an appointment to revise my will. Few people in Mapleton knew the full story of how I'd built my life and fortune. To most, I was simply Martha Harrington, the quiet widow who donated generously to the local library and never missed a community festival. At church potlucks, I was known for my reliable blueberry cobbler and polite conversation. At the local coffee shop, I was the elderly lady who left generous tips and occasionally helped struggling college students with their math homework. What remained largely private was the journey that had brought me here. Born to working-class parents in 1949, I'd grown up in a small apartment above my father's hardware store. My parents had survived the Depression and passed on its lessons with unwavering consistency. Save for emergencies, avoid debt except for appreciating assets, and always honor your commitments. I'd worked my way through college as a bookkeeper for local businesses each summer, an experience that taught me as much about financial management as my actual accounting courses. After graduation, I'd taken a job at a small accounting firm where I met Edward Harrington, brilliant with numbers, wonderfully charming with clients, and the love of my life for the next 47 years. Together, we had scraped and saved, until we could purchase the small firm where we worked when its owner retired. Many people told us we were crazy to take such a risk, but we believed in our vision of an accounting practice that truly partnered with clients rather than merely processing their taxes once a year. The early years were lean. We lived in a tiny rental house, drove used cars, and reinvested almost every penny of profit back into the business. When Claire came along, and then David 2 years later, we wondered if we'd made a terrible mistake striking out on our own. There were nights I would find Edward at the kitchen table at 2 a.m., surrounded by papers, worrying about making payroll. But gradually, our approach paid off. Our client list grew as word spread about our personal service. We expanded into financial planning, then wealth management. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By the time our children were in high school, Harrington Financial Group had become one of the most respected firms in the region. We'd moved into our Victorian home on Maple Street, though it was still a fixer-upper then, with peeling wallpaper and creaky floors that Edward would spend weekends repairing. I remember the day Edward and I paid off our mortgage. We were in our early 50s, and we'd made the final payment 15 years ahead of schedule. We didn't celebrate with an expensive dinner or new cars. Instead, we increased our retirement contributions and started college funds for our first 2 grandchildren, Taylor and Braden, who were just babies then. "We're building something that will outlast us," Edward would say, his eyes crinkling at the corners with quiet pride. When Sophie and Madison came along a few years later, we set up accounts for them too. Edward and I had been raised with the belief that education was the most valuable gift you could give a child, more valuable than any material possession. It was an investment in potential, in future security, in expanded horizons. By the time I turned 60, we had built a solid fortune, not through get-rich-quick schemes or market timing, but through consistent, disciplined investment and compound interest, working its quiet magic year after year. We had achieved what financial planners call FU money, enough wealth to be truly independent, to make decisions based on values rather than necessity. We'd begun the gradual process of transitioning leadership of the firm to our most trusted employees through a carefully structured buyout that would continue to provide income throughout our retirement while giving them ownership stakes. Edward had always believed in creating opportunities for others, just as someone had once believed in us. When Edward was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at 67, we faced it together with the same approach we'd applied to every other challenge in our lives: clear-eyed, practical, and focused on what mattered most. We made sure our affairs were in order, not just financially, but emotionally. We took that trip to Tuscany we'd always talked about. We spent precious time with our children and grandchildren. In those final months, Edward would often speak about his hopes for our family's future. "Money is just a tool, Martha," he'd remind me, his voice growing weaker but his mind still sharp. "A hammer can build a house or smash a window. It's about how you use it." After Edward passed, I immersed myself in community work, joining the hospital board, mentoring young entrepreneurs through the Chamber of Commerce, volunteering at the Literacy Center. I expanded the garden Edward and I had started together, finding solace in coaxing life from the soil he had enriched with compost each spring. What I didn't do was interfere in my children's parenting decisions, though I sometimes winced internally at the different approaches they took. Claire and Jeremy seemed to equate love with indulgence, stepping in to solve every problem their children encountered with money rather than guidance. Taylor and Sophie never had after-school jobs, never saved for anything significant, never experienced the pride that comes from earning something through effort rather than receiving it as an entitlement. David and Margaret took a more balanced approach. Braden and Madison had certain expectations placed on them: maintaining decent grades, contributing to household chores, finding summer employment. But even they had begun to drift toward what I privately termed financial dependency syndrome, increasingly turning to me when they encountered monetary challenges rather than working through them independently. I often wondered if I was partly to blame. Had I made help too readily available? Had my desire to be the supportive grandmother undermined the development of self-reliance? Edward would have asked these questions directly, challenged our children's assumptions, initiated uncomfortable but necessary conversations about money and responsibility. His absence left a void, not just in my heart, but in our family's financial dynamics. So when Taylor dismissed me with that casual, "Okay, boomer," it wasn't just about the disrespect of the moment. It was the culmination of a pattern I'd observed, building for years, a fundamental disconnect between how the wealth they now took for granted had been created and how they viewed its purpose. The grandchildren who rolled their eyes at my outdated financial advice were the same ones who never hesitated to request substantial loans that we all knew would never be repaid. As I drove to my appointment with Miriam the next morning, I wasn't angry. I was sad but resolute. Sometimes love requires making difficult decisions that might be initially misunderstood but ultimately serve a higher purpose than temporary harmony or being the beloved checkbook grandmother. "The money isn't the point," I could almost hear Edward saying. "It's about the values. What values are we reinforcing with every handout, every bailout, every financial rescue?" It was time to realign my financial decisions with the values that had built our wealth in the first place, and perhaps, in doing so, offer my family a different kind of inheritance than the one they were expecting. "Martha, are you certain about this?" Miriam asked, looking up from the legal pad where she'd been taking notes during our meeting. Her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she studied me with the careful scrutiny that had made her one of the most respected estate attorneys in 3 counties. "I've given it considerable thought," I replied, smoothing the fabric of my skirt. "Though I'd appreciate your perspective, as always." Miriam and I had a relationship that spanned decades. She'd helped Edward and me establish our first business contracts, had guided us through various iterations of our estate plan as our wealth grew, and had become a trusted friend in the process. She was one of the few people who understood both the letter and the spirit of what we had built. "Well," she said, setting down her pen, "legally, it's straightforward. Your estate is yours to distribute as you see fit. But I want to make sure you understand the potential fallout. Family dynamics can be permanently altered by inheritance decisions." I nodded, gazing out her office window at the maple trees lining Founders Street, their leaves turning brilliant shades of orange and crimson against the October sky. "I'm not making this decision in anger, Miriam, or spite. I'm genuinely concerned about the values I'm reinforcing every time I open my checkbook without question." Over the next hour, we outlined the revised structure of my estate plan. The changes were significant, but carefully considered. My $3 million estate, comprising the Victorian home, the continued buyout payments from Harrington Financial Group, various investment accounts, and Edward's life insurance proceeds, would no longer be distributed equally among my children and grandchildren as previously arranged. Instead, I established a series of educational trusts for my grandchildren with specific conditions attached. Funds would be available for tuition, books, and legitimate educational expenses, but only if they maintained a B average and contributed at least 20% of the costs through their own work or merit scholarships. Additional funds would be available for first home purchases, but structured as matching contributions. For every dollar they saved, the trust would provide $1, up to certain limits. The bulk of the estate would go to a foundation named after Edward, dedicated to financial literacy education and small business mentorship in our community. David and Claire would serve on the board alongside several respected community members, ensuring the family remained connected to Edward's legacy while preventing any individual from controlling the funds outright. "This actually reminds me quite a bit of Edward's thinking," Miriam observed as she reviewed the draft provisions. "He always talked about giving people fishing rods, not fish." "He would have been more direct than I've been," I admitted. "He wouldn't have let things reach this point." As I drove home from Miriam's office, I reflected on how we had arrived at this juncture. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual shift, almost imperceptible in its progression. Like watching your grandchildren grow, taller when you see them regularly, then suddenly realizing they're adults. When had Claire's indulgent parenting style, begun with good intentions about sparing her children the financial stress she perceived in her own upbringing, morphed into active enablement of entitlement? When had David's more structured approach begun to erode, particularly after Edward's passing? When had financial assistance transformed from occasional help during genuine emergencies to routine bailouts for poor decisions? I recalled the Christmas 5 years ago, shortly before Edward's diagnosis, when we'd given each grandchild a modest check along with personalized gifts. Taylor, then 18, had seemed visibly disappointed with the amount, later asking Claire within my earshot why Grandma and Grandpa are being so stingy when everyone knows they're loaded. Edward had overheard, too. Later that night, he'd said quietly, "We need to pay attention to that. It's a warning sign." But then came his illness, and the extended grieving process afterward, and somehow addressing these concerning patterns had been postponed again and again. It was easier to write checks than to have difficult conversations, especially when those conversations would inevitably be dismissed as the outdated perspectives of a woman who didn't understand how things work. Nowadays, I pulled into my driveway, noticing that my neighbor Ellen was putting away her gardening tools for the evening. She waved, and I walked over to the white picket fence that separated our properties. "You look different today, Martha," she observed, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. "Like you've made some kind of decision." Ellen had been widowed 2 years before me, and we'd formed a closer bond through our shared experience of navigating life without our partners of many decades. I acknowledged. A difficult one, but necessary, I think. Later that evening, as I prepared for the weekly call with Madison that had become our Sunday ritual since she'd moved to Boston for graduate school, I considered how to approach the changes I was making. Madison was perhaps the most financially responsible of my grandchildren, working part-time at a bookstore while pursuing her master's in library science, a career choice that had delighted me, though Claire had questioned its practicality. When Madison's face appeared on my tablet screen, her apartment visible in the background with its crowded bookshelves and the quilt I'd made for her graduation visible on the couch, I felt a surge of affection. "Hi, Grandma. How was your week?" she asked, her smile warm and genuine. We chatted about her classes, my garden, the book we were both currently reading for our long-distance book club of 2. As our conversation wound down, she hesitated briefly, before adding, "I hate to ask, but my car needs new brakes. The shop says it's going to be about $600. I've got half saved up, but with rent due next week." It was the perfect opening. "Madison, I'd like to talk with you about something important," I began, choosing my words carefully. "I've been doing some thinking about how I can best support you and your cousins, not just now, but in the long term." I explained the new approach I was taking, not mentioning the estate plan revision specifically, but outlining my shift toward educational support rather than emergency bailouts. "I'd be happy to help with the breaks," I concluded, "but I'd like to match what you've saved rather than covering the full remaining amount. Does that seem fair?" There was a moment of silence as Madison processed this change in our usual dynamic. "That's actually really fair, Grandma," she said finally. "I can pick up an extra shift this week to make up the difference." "I know you can," I said, feeling a small wave of relief at her response. "You're capable of so much more than I think you sometimes realize." After we said our goodbyes, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room, thinking about the varying reactions I could expect from the rest of the family when they learned of my decision. Madison's acceptance had been encouraging, but I harbored no illusions about how Taylor or Sophie might respond, or Claire for that matter, who had grown increasingly protective of her children's feelings regardless of their behavior. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Edward's parents that had followed us through every home we'd owned, chimed 9 times, its deep resonance filling the quiet house. I ran my fingers along the arm of Edward's leather chair, wishing, not for the first time, that I could consult with him one more time. "Am I doing the right thing?" I whispered to the empty room. The silence that answered seemed somehow affirming. I prepared for bed that evening. My mind drifted back through the decades, examining the path that had led to this crossroads. The decisions we make when our children are young have consequences that ripple forward in ways we can't always anticipate. I remembered Claire as a bright, curious 7-year-old, accompanying me to the office on a Saturday because Edward and I needed to prepare for an important client meeting. "Why do you have to work on weekends?" she'd asked, swiveling in Edward's desk chair while coloring in a financial ledger we'd given her to keep her occupied. "Because sometimes success requires sacrifice," I'd explained, simplifying for her young. "Mein Gott, we're building something important, and that means giving up some fun things now so we can have more choices later." She'd nodded solemnly, but over time, I realized Claire had internalized a different message than the one we'd intended to convey. Somewhere along the way, sacrifice now for future security had transformed in her mind to financial struggle equals deprivation. She'd developed a narrative about her childhood that bore little resemblance to our lived reality, one where she'd been denied opportunities because of our obsession with saving. "I never got to go to summer camp like my friends," she'd complained, once while discussing Taylor's request for an expensive teen tour abroad. "I'm not going to make my children miss out on experiences just to squirrel money away." The selective memory astonished me. Claire had attended local day camps every summer, taken dance and piano lessons, and gone on family vacations to national parks and historical sites. What she hadn't received were designer clothes in middle school or the brand new car she'd desperately wanted for her 16th birthday. In her revisionist history, these deprivations had loomed increasingly large. David, by contrast, had embraced many of our values around money, though I sometimes wondered if he'd taken the lessons too much to heart. Where Claire spent impulsively, David could be almost rigid in his frugality. When Margaret had wanted to renovate their kitchen after 15 years of making do with outdated appliances, he'd resisted for months, until I gently suggested that balance was as important as discipline when it came to financial decisions. The grandchildren, of course, had been shaped by their parents' approaches. Taylor and Sophie had grown up with Disney World vacations, sweet 16 parties that rivaled small weddings, and unlimited access to credit cards from an early age. They'd never had summer jobs or chores tied to their allowances. Their social media accounts showcased lives of carefully curated privilege, designer handbags, champagne brunches, and getaways to coastal resorts. Braden and Madison had been raised with more boundaries, but even they had been affected by the gradual loosening of financial expectations that had occurred after Edward's death. The occasional grandma bailout had become increasingly common, and I'd seen a subtle but concerning shift in their approach to financial challenges. Why economize or work extra hours when grandma would help if asked? And here was the heart of my dilemma. In trying to be helpful, had I actually hindered their development of crucial life skills? I thought back to my own childhood and the formative experiences that had shaped my understanding of money. My father, a hardware store owner with an 8th-grade education but a mind for business, had insisted I learn to balance the store accounts when I was just 12. "Money doesn't grow on trees, Martha Jean," he'd say, patiently showing me how to reconcile the day's receipts. "It grows through attention and care, just like anything worthwhile." My mother, a skilled seamstress who could transform remnant fabrics into fashionable dresses, had taught me to distinguish between value and price. "Cheap things that fall apart are never a bargain," she'd explain, showing me how to examine stitching and fabric quality. "Sometimes the most expensive decision is the one that seems least expensive at the time." These lessons had served me well throughout my life. When Edward and I were just starting out, I'd furnished our first apartment with carefully selected secondhand pieces that we gradually replaced over the years. Many peers had gone into debt buying new furniture suites they couldn't afford, only to watch them deteriorate from poor quality while still making payments. I remembered our first significant investment beyond our business, a small rental property, near the university that seemed terrifyingly expensive at the time. We'd calculated the numbers repeatedly before committing, then spent weekends painting and making repairs ourselves to keep costs down. That property had eventually been sold to fund expansion of the firm, multiplying our initial investment several times over. Edward and I had tried to pass these lessons on to our children, involving them in age-appropriate financial discussions and decisions. We'd opened savings accounts for them, matched their contributions for larger purchases, and talked openly about budgeting for family expenses. We'd explained compounding interest using real examples from our own investments, showing them how patience and consistency built wealth over time. But somewhere between our generation and our grandchildren's, the transmission of these values had faltered. Perhaps we hadn't been explicit enough. Perhaps the growing prosperity of our business had made the earlier struggles seem less relevant. Perhaps the consumer culture and easy credit of recent decades had simply overwhelmed our quiet lessons about financial responsibility. The most painful realization was that I had participated in this erosion of values by becoming the financial safety net that prevented natural consequences from teaching their own powerful lessons. Each time I'd written a check to cover Taylor's overspending or Braden's impulsive investment in a friend's startup, I'd robbed them of the opportunity to develop resilience and problem-solving skills. I thought about a conversation Edward and I had shortly before his diagnosis, during a weekend visit from Claire's family. Taylor, then a college sophomore, had casually mentioned maxing out her credit card on spring break in Cancun. When Edward had expressed concern, Jeremy had laughed it off. "You only live once, right? She's building memories." Later that night, Edward had said to me, "We've worked so hard to build security for them, but I worry we've failed to build understanding. What happens to all we've created if they don't grasp how it was created in the first place?" I hadn't had a good answer then. Perhaps my revised estate plan was, in part, a belated response to his question. As I climbed into bed, I found myself wondering how each family member would react to my decision. Madison had already shown a thoughtful response to my smaller boundary about the car repair. But Taylor? Sophie? Claire? I could anticipate resistance, accusations of favoritism, perhaps even the distancing that comes when financial expectations are disrupted. Was I prepared for the potential fallout? The quiet chill at family gatherings? The possibility that some might choose to cut contact, rather than adapt to new boundaries? The answer came to me as I drifted toward sleep. Yes, I was prepared. Because the discomfort of confrontation now seemed far less damaging than the long-term harm of continuing to enable financial dependency and the entitlement that accompanied it. Sometimes the most loving choice isn't the easiest one. A lesson I hoped my family would eventually come to understand, even if the path to that understanding might be difficult for all of us. The following weekend brought the first test of my new approach. Braden called on Saturday morning, his voice carrying that particular tone of forced casualness that I'd come to recognize as the prelude to a financial request. "Grandma, how are you doing? I've been meaning to call all week." "I'm well, thank you," I replied, settling into my garden chair, phone pressed to my ear as I watched a pair of cardinals flit among the bushes Edward had planted years ago. "How's the new job going?" Braden had recently taken a position at a tech startup after bouncing between 3 different companies in the 2 years since his college graduation. Each move had been explained as a strategic career advancement, though I'd privately wondered if his difficulty maintaining employment might have deeper roots. "That's actually why I'm calling," he said, clearing his throat. "There's been a slight hiccup with the onboarding process. Some paperwork delay means my first paycheck won't arrive until next month." I waited, already anticipating where this conversation was heading. "I was wondering if you might be able to help me cover rent this month. It's due on Friday and I'm a little short. Just a temporary thing, of course. I'll pay you back as soon as that first check comes through." In the past, I would have immediately assured him that money would be transferred to his account by the end of the day. This time, I took a deliberate breath before responding. "I'm sorry to hear about the delay, Braden. That certainly puts you in a difficult position. What options have you considered for addressing this?" The silence that followed told me my deviation from our usual script had caught him off guard. "Options?" he finally asked, confusion evident in his voice. I mean, I guess I could ask Mom and Dad, but they just helped me with the security deposit last month. What about speaking with your landlord about the situation? Many will work with tenants on a short delay when there's a legitimate reason, especially if you've been reliable in the past. I hadn't thought of that, he admitted. But, Grandma, it would be so much simpler if you could just— Braden, I interrupted gently. I'm making some changes in how I approach financial assistance for all of you grandchildren. I'm happy to help with educational expenses or to match funds you're saving for important goals, but I'm stepping back from covering ongoing living expenses or financial emergencies. Another long pause followed. Is this because of what Taylor said at dinner? The okay boomer thing? Because that was just Taylor being Taylor. You know how she is. This isn't about any single incident, I explained. It's about making sure I'm truly helping all of you in the long term, not just putting band-aids on immediate problems. So you're not going to help me? His voice had taken on a wounded quality that made my resolve waver momentarily. I'm helping you in a different way, I corrected. By encouraging you to develop your own problem-solving skills. I believe you're capable of handling this situation, Braden. The conversation ended shortly afterward, with Braden promising curtly to figure something out. The hurt in his voice stayed with me as I continued my gardening, planting the tulip bulbs that would bloom next spring. I wondered if I would still be welcome in his life by then, or if this boundary would create a rift too wide to bridge. My phone rang twice more that day. First Claire, then David. News apparently traveled fast in our family network. Mom, what's this about refusing to help Braden with his rent? Claire demanded without preamble. I explained my new approach again, emphasizing that it applied to all 4 grandchildren equally and was intended to foster independence rather than punishment. This is incredibly poor timing, Claire responded, her voice tight with disapproval. He's just starting a new job, trying to establish himself. Do you want him to get evicted? Is that your idea of teaching life lessons? Of course not, I replied calmly. But Braden has options he hasn't explored, including simply communicating with his landlord about the paycheck delay. That's part of being an adult, navigating these challenges directly rather than immediately, looking for someone else to solve them. I can't believe you're doing this, Claire said. First you criticized Taylor's financial choices at dinner, and now you're withholding help from Braden when he genuinely needs it. It's like you've suddenly decided to pull the rug out from under all of them. That's not my intention, Claire. Well, intention and impact are 2 different things, aren't they? Dad would never have done this. The invocation of Edward stung, as she'd no doubt intended it to. Before I could respond, she had ended the call. David's approach was more measured, though I could hear the concern in his voice. Mom, I understand wanting the kids to be more self-sufficient. Margaret and I have had the same conversations about Braden and Madison, but this seems like a rather abrupt change. Couldn't you have given them some warning? Perhaps I should have, I conceded, but I've been dropping hints for years about my concerns, and they've been largely ignored or dismissed. Sometimes a clear boundary is necessary when subtle suggestions aren't working. Fair enough, David said after a moment. Just be prepared for some emotional fallout. Braden called Madison in tears, and she mentioned it to us. He feels like you're punishing him for something Taylor did. I'll reach out to him again, I promised. Make sure he understands this isn't about punishment. By Sunday evening, I'd sent thoughtful texts to both Braden and Madison, explaining my perspective more fully and reiterating my continued love and support, even as the nature of that support evolved. Madison responded with a simple, I understand, Grandma, while Braden remained silent. Claire, meanwhile, had apparently taken matters into her own hands. She called Sunday night to inform me that she and Jeremy had covered Braden's rent, so he wouldn't be homeless, since his own grandmother wouldn't help him. That's your choice, Claire, I replied. refusing to be baited into an argument. As parents, you certainly have every right to help your nephew if you feel it's appropriate. "This isn't like you, Mom," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Are you sure you're feeling all right? You haven't been the same since Dad passed, and I worry that you're making decisions you might regret." The implication that my boundary setting must be the result of grief or cognitive decline, rather than deliberate choice, was both hurtful and telling. Claire had always struggled with accepting viewpoints that differed from her own, particularly when they challenged her comfortable narratives. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I'm quite clear-headed about this decision. It comes from love, not spite or confusion." "If you say so," she replied, skepticism evident in her tone. "Just know that we're all talking about this, and everyone's upset. I hope whatever point you're trying to make is worth damaging your relationship with your grandchildren." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen, a cup of tea growing cold before me as I contemplated the escalating tension. Was I wrong? Was I risking too much by taking this stand? I picked up the framed photo that sat on my kitchen windowsill. All 4 grandchildren at the lake house where we'd spent summers when they were younger. Taylor and Sophie sitting on the dock, their sun-kissed legs dangling in the water. Braden teaching Madison to skip stones, his arm around her shoulders as she concentrated on her throw. They were still those children, somewhere beneath the layers of entitlement and expectation that had accumulated over the years. If I truly believed in their capability and resilience, I needed to stand firm, even as the discomfort of this transitional period intensified. The real test, I knew, was still to come. In 3 weeks, we would gather for Thanksgiving at Claire and Jeremy's home, the first family holiday since my decision to revise my estate plan and set new financial boundaries. By then, word of my meeting with Miriam would likely have spread through family channels. I took a deep breath and straightened my shoulders, channeling Edward's quiet strength. "We'll weather this storm," I whispered to his memory, "just as we weathered all the others." I hadn't anticipated how quickly news of my estate plan revisions would spread, nor the particular catalyst that would bring matters to a head. Miriam Stevens and I had been friends for decades, but we lived in a small town. Her assistant, Deborah, was married to Jeremy's cousin Thomas. The connection had never seemed significant before, but in Mapleton, information traveled through such unexpected channels. I was deadheading roses in my front garden when Claire's SUV screeched to a halt in my driveway, the abruptness of her arrival sending a flock of starlings into startled flight from the nearby oak tree. She emerged from the vehicle with a storm, in her eyes, clutching her phone as though it contained evidence of a grievous crime. "Is it true?" she demanded, not bothering with greeting as she strode up the garden path. "Have you really cut the grandchildren out of your will?" I set down my gardening shears, removing my gloves deliberately as I gathered my thoughts. "That's not an accurate characterization of what I've done." "Well, enlighten me then," she said, crossing her arms. "Because according to Thomas, who heard from Deborah, you've completely rewritten your estate plan to disinherit your own family." I gestured toward the porch swing. "I'd be happy to explain my decisions, but I'd prefer to do it sitting down, as a civilized conversation rather than a confrontation in my front yard." Claire hesitated, then followed me to the porch, though she perched on the edge of the swing as if prepared for a hasty departure. "I haven't disinherited anyone," I began, settling beside her. "I've restructured how my estate will be distributed, to better align with my values and what I believe will truly benefit the family in the long term." I explained the educational trusts with their associated conditions, the matching funds for first homes, and the foundation that would continue Edward's legacy while involving the family in meaningful ways. "So you're still controlling everyone, even after you're gone," Claire interrupted, "making them jump through hoops for money that should rightfully be theirs." "Rightfully?" I echoed, the word striking a nerve. "Claire, the money Edward and I accumulated through decades of hard work isn't anyone's birthright. It's a resource that can either help or harm the next generation, depending on how it's transferred. This is about Taylor, isn't it? One snarky comment at dinner and you've decided to punish all of them. This isn't about punishment, I said firmly. It's about responding to patterns I've observed over years, not a single incident. Your father and I built our lives on certain principles: education, hard work, financial responsibility, giving back to the community. I'm structuring my estate to reinforce those values, not undermine them. Claire's eyes filled with tears, surprising both of us. Why didn't you talk to me about this first, as your daughter? Instead, I have to hear about it through town gossip. Her vulnerability penetrated my carefully constructed composure. Perhaps I had handled this poorly, making decisions in isolation that affected the entire family. You're right, I conceded. I should have discussed this with you and David before finalizing the changes. That was an oversight on my part. An oversight? Claire repeated, her voice rising again. Mom, you've basically told your grandchildren they aren't trustworthy enough to inherit directly. How do you think that makes them feel? How do you think it makes me feel as their mother? I understand this is difficult, I began. No, you don't understand at all, she cut in. Everyone's devastated. Sophie called me crying this morning after Braden told her. Taylor's posting thinly veiled comments on social media about toxic elders who use money to control people. Even Madison is hurt, and she's always been your favorite. I don't have favorites, I protested. Of course you do. You've always approved of David and Margaret's parenting more than mine and Jeremy's. This is just your final judgment on us all. The conversation deteriorated from there, with Claire cycling between anger, hurt, and accusations. She brought up perceived slights from decades ago, parenting criticisms she believed I'd made but I had no recollection of, and finally, the suggestion that perhaps I was experiencing early dementia like her friend's mother who had made bizarre financial decisions before her diagnosis. When she finally left an hour later, we were no closer to understanding than when she'd arrived, and the chasm between us felt wider than it had ever been. That evening, I received a group text from Taylor to the entire family. Just so everyone knows, I'm not jumping through Grandma's hoops for money. Some things are more important than inheritance, like self-respect and freedom from manipulation. Anyone else want to take a stand? Sophie quickly replied with a heart emoji and, standing with you, sis. Braden responded, let's discuss in person. Before making statements. Thanksgiving is coming up. Madison remained conspicuously silent. I set down my phone, my hands trembling slightly. In trying to instill better values, had I instead catalyzed a family rebellion? Had my attempt at principled estate planning backfired completely? As darkness fell over my garden, I felt more alone than I had since Edward's passing. The weight of family disapproval pressed down like a physical presence, making even the familiar rooms of my home feel suddenly strange and unwelcoming. This wasn't just a disagreement over money. This was a fundamental clash of worldviews, about entitlement versus earning, about responsibility versus freedom, about the meaning of family itself, and I had no idea how to bridge the divide I'd created. The week following Claire's confrontation was one of the loneliest I'd experienced since Edward's passing. My phone, usually lighting up with family texts and calls, remained stubbornly quiet. The silence was punctuated only by a brief message from David suggesting we give things time to cool down before Thanksgiving. I found myself wandering through my home, touching objects that held our family history. The grandfather clock Edward had restored, the quilt my mother had made for our wedding, the collection of handprints in clay that the grandchildren had created one Christmas. These tactile connections to my family felt suddenly precious and precarious. Had I made a terrible mistake? The question haunted me as I moved through my daily routines. I'd been so certain of the righteousness of my position, but the pain I'd caused was undeniable. On Wednesday evening, I received an unexpected visit from Ellen, my neighbor and friend. She arrived bearing a blueberry pie and concern in her eyes. "I haven't seen you in your garden for days," she said as I invited her in. "That's not like you, especially in bulb planting season." Over tea and pie at my kitchen table, I found myself sharing the entire situation. The gradual shift in my grandchildren's attitudes and expectations, the OK Boomer incident that had crystallized my concerns, my estate plan revisions, and the family rupture that had followed. Ellen listened. Without interruption, her expression thoughtful. Unlike many in our age group, she hadn't been fortunate enough to accumulate significant wealth. Her late husband's medical bills had depleted much of their savings before his passing, and she lived modestly on his pension and her Social Security. "Martha," she said finally, setting down her teacup, "may I offer a perspective from someone who's made different financial choices and faced different circumstances?" I nodded, grateful for any wisdom she might provide. "I've always admired how you and Edward built your success through hard work and careful planning. That's commendable, truly." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I wonder if you've considered that the world your grandchildren are navigating is fundamentally different from the one we knew at their age." "In what way?" I asked. "When we were starting out, a college education guaranteed a good job. Housing was affordable. A single income could support a family. Healthcare costs weren't bankrupting people." She gestured around my comfortable kitchen. "The path you and Edward followed, work hard, save diligently, invest wisely, that path still exists, but it's narrowed considerably. The margins for error are smaller." I considered her words, thinking about the economic realities my grandchildren faced. Student loans far exceeding what previous generations had carried, housing markets in major cities that put home ownership out of reach for many young professionals, the gig economy with its lack of stability and benefits. "That doesn't excuse entitlement or disrespect," I countered. "No, it doesn't," Ellen agreed. "But it might explain some of the frustration behind it. When Taylor dismisses your financial advice as outdated, perhaps she's not just being disrespectful. Perhaps she's expressing genuine doubt that the rules that worked for you will work for her." I hadn't considered this perspective. Had I been too quick to interpret their attitudes as simple entitlement rather than a response to genuine generational challenges? "What would you do in my position?" I asked Ellen. She smiled gently. "I'm certainly not qualified to advise someone on managing a $3 million estate, Martha. But speaking as a mother and grandmother, I'd want to make sure my decisions were bringing my family closer, not driving them apart, especially after losing my partner." After Ellen left, I sat in Edward's chair in my study, surrounded by the books we'd collected over our life together. I reached for the leather-bound journal I'd kept during the early years of our marriage, opening to entries from when we were struggling to establish our business while raising young children. October 15th, 1976. Edward had to tell 3 employees today that we can't make payroll until the Hansen account pays their overdue invoice. I've never seen him so dejected. Claire has been asking for ballet lessons like her friend Melissa, but there's simply no money for extras right now. Sometimes, I wonder if we've made a terrible mistake striking out on our own. November 2nd, 1976. Mom offered to pay for Claire's ballet lessons as an early Christmas gift. My pride wanted to refuse, but the joy on Claire's face when we told her was worth swallowing that pride. Mom was wise enough not to make it a recurring commitment, just enough help to get us through this tight spot while preserving our dignity and responsibility for our own choices. I'd forgotten that moment of grace, how my mother had offered support in a way that empowered rather than enabled, that acknowledged our temporary struggle without undermining our long-term independence. That single act of generosity, offered with love rather than judgment, had meant everything during a difficult time. Had I lost sight of the difference between enabling dependency and offering compassionate support? Was there a middle path I hadn't considered? I closed the journal and gazed at the family photo on my desk, taken at Edward's 70th birthday celebration. We were all together on the back porch, the lake shimmering behind us, Edward's arm around my shoulders, our children and grandchildren grouped around us, everyone smiling. That connection, that sense of belonging to each other, was the truly valuable inheritance, far more precious than any financial assets. If my estate plan was damaging those bonds, perhaps I needed to reconsider my approach. Not abandon my principles or concerns, but perhaps find a way to communicate them with more empathy and collaboration than I'd managed thus far. To recognize both the different world my grandchildren inhabited and the timeless values that could still serve them within it. I went to bed that night without clear answers, but with a growing sense that the path forward would require more nuance than my original approach had allowed. The question wasn't whether to maintain boundaries, but how to establish them in a way that strengthened rather than severed family bonds. The next morning, I woke with a clarity that had eluded me for days. The path forward wasn't about reversing my decision entirely. The concerns that had prompted my estate plan revisions remained valid. But my approach had been flawed, implementing changes without conversation, making judgments without fully understanding the perspectives of those affected. I called Miriam's office as soon as they opened. "Martha," Miriam greeted me. "I was just thinking about calling you. Word has gotten back to me about how your family is responding to the changes. I'm sorry it's created such turbulence." "That's why I'm calling," I explained. "I'd like to put a temporary hold on finalizing the new documents, not to abandon the changes entirely, but to create space for some important family conversations first." "That's entirely possible," she assured me. "Nothing has been formally executed yet. Take the time you need to get this right." My next call was to David, who had always been the more diplomatic of my children. "I'd like to have a family meeting," I told him when he answered. "Before Thanksgiving, somewhere neutral with all the adults present, you and Margaret, Claire and Jeremy, and all 4 grandchildren." "That's ambitious," he said cautiously. "Claire's still pretty upset, and Taylor has been rather vocal about not wanting to engage in any manipulation, as she puts it." "I understand their reluctance," I acknowledged. "But I'm not asking for agreement, just attendance. I want to listen more than talk. Would you help me organize this?" David was silent for a moment. "You're serious about listening, not just explaining your position again?" "Completely serious. I've realized there are perspectives I haven't adequately considered." "All right," he said finally. "I'll speak with Claire and the kids. No promises, but I'll try." Over the next 2 days, a flurry of text messages and calls established the parameters for our gathering. We would meet that Saturday afternoon at the Lakeside Community Center, neutral territory with a private meeting room available. Everyone, somewhat remarkably, agreed to attend, though Claire specified that she was coming under protest, and Taylor added that she was only participating to support Mom. As I prepared for this crucial conversation, I recognized that my approach would determine whether it became a path to healing or a further entrenching of positions. I spent hours reflecting on what I truly wanted for my family and my legacy, beyond the specifics of financial distribution. Saturday arrived crisp and clear, autumn sunlight filtering through the community center's windows as I arrived early to arrange the meeting space. I had deliberately chosen a round table rather than a rectangular one, wanting to visually emphasize our equality in this conversation. The family arrived in stages, David and Margaret first, offering quiet support, Madison and Braden next, both looking uncomfortable but determined, Claire and Jeremy, their expressions guarded, and finally, Taylor and Sophie, projecting an air of deliberate detachment. Once everyone was seated, an awkward silence fell over the room. 10 pairs of eyes turned to me expectantly. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "I know this gathering comes after a difficult period, and I appreciate your willingness to be here despite that." I took a deep breath, centering myself for what needed to be said. "I made a mistake," I continued, watching surprise register on several faces. Not in being concerned about certain patterns I've observed in our family dynamics, but in how I chose to address those concerns. I made unilateral decisions affecting all of you without proper conversation or consideration of your perspectives. For that, I sincerely apologize. Claire's rigid posture softened slightly. Taylor and Sophie exchanged glances. I'd like to start fresh today, I said. Not by dictating terms or presenting a plan for you to accept or reject, but by opening a genuine dialogue about family, money, values, and the different realities each generation faces. I turned to face my grandchildren directly. When I was dismissive of your financial approaches as simply being entitled or irresponsible, I failed to recognize how dramatically economic circumstances have changed since my generation started out. The paths that worked for your grandfather and me may not be entirely accessible to you in the same ways. Then I addressed Claire and Jeremy, David and Margaret. And when I judged your parenting choices without acknowledging the different challenges you've faced raising children in an increasingly complex world, I wasn't being fair or supportive. I could feel the tension in the room beginning to dissipate, replaced by a tentative openness. But I also want to share some genuine concerns, I continued carefully. When Taylor dismissed me as an out-of-touch boomer, it hurt not just because of the disrespect, but because it suggested that the experiences and knowledge I've accumulated over decades have no value in today's world. And when financial assistance became an expectation rather than an occasional help, I worried about fostering dependency rather than capability. Taylor looked down at her hands, a flash of what might have been remorse crossing her face. What I'm proposing today isn't a specific estate plan, I concluded, but a new process. I'd like us to work together, all of us, to create a family financial philosophy that honors both timeless principles and current realities, that recognizes both the privileges and responsibilities that come with the resources Edward and I were fortunate enough to accumulate. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable this time, but contemplative. David was the first to speak. I think that's a reasonable approach, Mom, and I appreciate your willingness to reconsider how these decisions are made. I'm still not clear what this means practically, Claire said, her tone cautious but not hostile. Are you keeping the changes to your will or not? That's what I hope we can determine together, I explained. Perhaps some elements of what I proposed make sense while others need reconsideration. I'm open to that conversation. Slowly, tentatively, each family member began to share their thoughts. The dialogue wasn't always easy. Old hurts and assumptions surfaced, disagreements emerged. But there was a fundamental shift in the energy. We were talking with each other rather than at each other, listening for understanding rather than ammunition. As our scheduled 2 hours stretched to 3, I realized we had begun something significant, not just a negotiation about inheritance, but a deeper reconciliation about what we owed each other as family, financially and otherwise. We didn't resolve everything that day. We couldn't. But we established a framework for ongoing conversation and a commitment to approaching these issues with respect for different perspectives. When we finally adjourned, agreeing to continue our discussion after Thanksgiving, Madison approached me as others gathered their belongings. Grandma, she said quietly, thank you for this. I was really afraid our family was falling apart. I hugged her, feeling the first genuine hope I'd experienced since this crisis began. Families bend sometimes, I told her. But with care and patience, they don't have to break. In the days following our family meeting, the varied reactions from my family members revealed much about their individual characters and our relationships. Madison was the first to reach out, sending a thoughtful email the very next morning. I've been thinking about what you said about creating a family financial philosophy, she wrote. I realize I've never really considered the responsibility that comes with inheritance, only the benefits. Maybe we could talk more about Grandpa's approach to philanthropy sometime? I'd like to understand that better. Her natural curiosity and openness made her the perfect bridge builder. I invited her for tea that weekend, looking forward to sharing stories about Edward's commitment to giving back to the community that had supported our business. Braden's response came through more practical channels. He called midweek with news that he'd negotiated a payment plan with his landlord for the delayed rent and had picked up weekend shifts at a local coffee shop to cover the gap until his first paycheck arrived. It wasn't easy, he admitted. The landlord was pretty skeptical at first, but once I explained the situation and offered to pay a small late fee, he was willing to work with me. Actually felt kind of good to solve it myself. The pride in his voice was unmistakable. A new emotion replacing the entitled expectation I'd grown accustomed to hearing. This small success had given him something money couldn't buy: confidence in his own capability. David and Margaret expressed their support through action, organizing a follow-up family meeting for the week after Thanksgiving, and creating a shared document where everyone could contribute thoughts about family values and financial principles ahead of time. We thought a structured approach might help keep the conversation productive, David explained, his educator's mindset bringing valuable organization to our process. Claire's reaction was more complex. She remained reserved in our direct communications, but I noticed subtle shifts in her social media posts: fewer photos of luxury purchases, more content about family traditions and meaningful experiences. Whether this represented genuine reflection or image management was unclear, but it suggested some processing was happening beneath the surface. The most dramatic contrast came from Taylor and Sophie. Taylor maintained a studied distance, responding to group messages with minimal acknowledgement and declining my invitation for a one-on-one lunch due to scheduling conflicts. Her resistance wasn't surprising. She had perhaps the most significant adjustment to make in terms of expectations and self-image. Sophie, however, surprised me with a visit one afternoon, arriving unannounced with a small potted orchid. I thought, "Your windowsill could use some color," she said awkwardly, handing me the plant. As we sat in my kitchen sharing coffee and the cranberry scones I'd just baked, she confessed, "I've been thinking about what you said about different economic realities. Between generations, I did some research and, well, I didn't realize how much more affordable college and housing were when you were my age." Her willingness to investigate rather than simply react demonstrated a maturity I hadn't previously given her credit for. "But," she continued, meeting my eyes directly, "I also realize that plenty of people my age are managing without constantly asking their grandparents for money, so maybe there's truth on both sides." That balanced perspective, acknowledging both generational challenges and personal responsibility, gave me hope for our ongoing conversations. Not everyone would arrive at understanding at the same pace or through the same path, but the process had begun. As Thanksgiving approached, I felt cautiously optimistic. The family system was rebalancing itself, not returning to the previous dynamic where I functioned as the unquestioning financial safety net, but evolving toward something healthier for all of us. Thanksgiving arrived with a mixture of traditional comforts and lingering tensions. Claire had insisted on hosting as usual, and I arrived early to help with preparations, hoping the shared activity might ease some of the strain between us. The kitchen had always been neutral territory for our family, a place where conversations flowed more naturally alongside the passing of ingredients and stirring of pots. As we worked side by side preparing Edward's cherished cornbread stuffing recipe, Claire finally broached the subject that had been hovering unspoken between us. "I've been thinking about what you said at the community center," she began, carefully measuring sage into a spoon, "about different generations facing different challenges." I continued dicing celery, giving her space to continue at her own pace. "Jeremy and I were looking at some financial planning projections last night," she said. "Taylor and Sophie's generation might be the first in modern history to be worse off financially than their parents. That's sobering." "It is," I agreed quietly. "But," she continued, her knife pausing briefly over an onion, "I'm starting to wonder if our approach, Jeremy's and mine, has actually made it harder for them in some ways. We've been so focused on giving them everything, protecting them from struggle, that maybe we've, I don't know, underprepared them. This moment of self-reflection from Claire was unexpected. Throughout the tensions of recent weeks, she had firmly positioned herself as defending her children against my unfair judgments. This shift toward questioning her own parenting choices represented significant movement. Parenting doesn't come with a manual, I offered gently. We all do the best we can with what we know at the time. Claire smiled faintly. That's generous of you to say, considering how defensive I've been. As our food preparation continued, Claire shared her growing concerns about Sophie's lack of career direction despite her expensive education, and Taylor's expectations of continued financial support while pursuing her influencer ambitions. These weren't new issues, but Claire's willingness to acknowledge them as problems rather than merely defending her children's choices marked an important shift. The real breakthrough, however, came after dinner. The meal itself had progressed with careful politeness, everyone mindful of the fragile peace we were maintaining. As we cleared plates and served dessert, Taylor unexpectedly approached me in the kitchen where I was plating pie slices. "Grandma, could I help with that?" she asked, reaching for the dessert plates. We worked in silence for a moment before she spoke again, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I've been thinking about what happened at our last family dinner. The, okay, boomer thing." She kept her eyes fixed on the pumpkin pie she was serving. "It was disrespectful, and I'm sorry for that." I paused in my task, surprised by this unsolicited apology. "Thank you, Taylor. I appreciate that. I still don't agree with everything you believe about money," she added quickly. "But I shouldn't have dismissed you like that. Different perspectives can coexist with mutual respect," I offered. She nodded, considering this. "Mom said something interesting last night. She said Grandpa always told her that wealth was a responsibility, not just a privilege. What did he mean by that?" The genuine curiosity in her question opened a door I had thought firmly closed. As we finished preparing dessert, I shared Edward's philosophy about wealth, how he viewed it as a tool for creating security, opportunity, and positive impact, not as an end in itself or a measure of personal worth. Taylor listened with unexpected attentiveness. "That's actually kind of cool. Different from how Mom and Dad talk about money. It wasn't a complete transformation." Taylor still carried many of the attitudes and expectations that had concerned me initially. But in that moment, a genuine exchange had replaced defensive posturing. A small opening had appeared where understanding might eventually grow. As we carried desserts to the dining room together, I felt a sensation I hadn't experienced in quite some time with Taylor. The simple pleasure of connection, unburdened by financial expectations or generational judgment. It was a modest beginning, but breakthroughs often start with such small, sincere moments. By early spring, the changes in our family's dynamics had taken root and begun to flourish, in ways I hadn't dared hope for during the tense days following my initial decision. The series of family meetings we'd held throughout the winter had gradually evolved from cautious negotiations into genuine conversations about values, responsibilities, and the meaning of legacy. We hadn't always agreed. There were still fundamental differences in perspective between generations and individuals. But we had found ways to acknowledge these differences without allowing them to divide us. The most visible transformations appeared in my grandchildren, though each followed their own unique path. Madison had embraced the concept of financial literacy with characteristic thoroughness, leveraging her librarian training to create a family resource guide on everything, from basic budgeting to ethical investing. She'd also proposed a matching donation program where I would match any charitable contributions made by the grandchildren, effectively doubling their philanthropic impact while allowing them to direct resources toward causes they personally valued. Grandpa always said giving should be both meaningful and strategic, she reminded us during a family gathering. This way, we learn both aspects. Braden's evolution took a more practical turn. After successfully navigating his rent crisis without my financial intervention, he'd developed a newfound confidence in his problem-solving abilities. This translated into more stability at work, where he'd received his first performance-based raise and a more measured approach to financial decisions. He'd even opened a retirement account, something he'd previously dismissed as something to worry about later. "Start small, but start now," he explained, echoing advice Edward had often given. "That's what Grandpa would say, right?" Sophie's transformation perhaps surprised me most. She'd approached me in January with an unexpected proposal. She wanted to spend 6 months working in the administrative office at Harrington Financial Group to better understand the business Edward and I had built. "Not permanently," she'd clarified. "I still want to pursue my own interests eventually, but I realized I know almost nothing about this company that's such an important part of our family history." The managing partners, many of whom had worked alongside Edward and me for decades, welcomed her with enthusiasm. Sophie's natural social skills and marketing instincts had proven valuable, and she'd developed a genuine appreciation for the company culture we'd cultivated, one built on integrity, client relationships, and long-term thinking rather than quick profits. Even Taylor, the most resistant to change initially, had shown subtle but significant shifts. The dismissive "okay boomer" comments had disappeared from her vocabulary, replaced by more thoughtful questions when she disagreed with my perspective. While she remained committed to her influencer career, she'd begun supplementing it with social media consulting work for small businesses, turning her online skills into more sustainable income rather than relying on family support to bridge gaps. As for Claire and Jeremy, their parenting approach had evolved toward greater accountability without sacrificing the support they wished to provide. They now attached reasonable conditions to financial assistance, matching funds rather than outright gifts, expectations of detailed budgets, discussions about long-term implications of choices. "We're still helping," Claire explained during one of our coffee dates, a monthly tradition we'd reinstated, but in ways that build capabilities instead of dependencies. My revised estate plan, finalized in March, reflected this family-wide evolution. Working together with Miriam and with input from all family members, we'd created a structure that balanced directed support for education and key life milestones with appropriate levels of autonomy. The Edward Harrington Foundation remained a centerpiece, but with more collaborative governance that included roles for each family member based on their strengths and interests. The $3 million estate that had become such a focal point of family tension had been transformed from a source of entitlement or control into a shared legacy, one that honored both Edward's values and the family's ongoing evolution. As I watched spring bulbs pushing through the soil in my garden, the same tulips I'd been planting when this family crisis began, I reflected on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from what had initially seemed like an irreparable rupture. Not just revised financial arrangements, but deeper understanding, renewed connections, and a more authentic appreciation for each other beyond monetary transactions. On a warm evening in early June, I hosted a gathering in my backyard to celebrate Madison's acceptance into a prestigious library science doctoral program. The space was transformed with string lights hanging from trees, tables adorned with fresh flowers from my garden, and the scent of Edward's famous barbecue recipe wafting from the grill where David now stood, spatula in hand. What struck me most as I looked around at my assembled family wasn't just their presence, but the quality of their interactions. Conversations flowed naturally, without the undercurrent of financial expectation that had previously colored so many gatherings. Braden was explaining his new work project to Jeremy with genuine enthusiasm. Sophie and Claire were arranging desserts while discussing an upcoming community fundraiser they'd both volunteered for. Taylor was showing Madison how to optimize her professional social media profile for academic networking. These were not the same people who had sat around my dining room table last October, when a dismissive, okay, boomer had set in motion such profound changes. As twilight settled over the garden, I gently tapped my glass for attention. Public speeches had always been Edward's domain, but some moments called for words. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice steady despite the emotion I felt. Not just to celebrate Madison's wonderful achievement, but for the journey we've taken together these past months. I looked around at each face, illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns as darkness gathered. Edward used to say that family wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the strength of the bonds between us, in our ability to support each other's growth while allowing space for individual paths. I paused, gathering my thoughts. I believe he would be proud of what we've created together. Not a perfect family, but a resilient one. One that can face challenges honestly and emerge stronger. Taylor raised her glass. To Grandpa's wisdom, she offered, and to Grandma's courage to uphold it, even when it wasn't easy to hear. The simple acknowledgement brought unexpected tears to my eyes, not because I needed validation for the difficult stand I'd taken, but because it signified how far we'd come, from defensive resistance to genuine appreciation for the values Edward and I had tried to instill. Later, as the gathering wound down and family members began to depart with hugs and promises of next visits, Madison lingered behind to help clean up. "You know," she said thoughtfully as we folded tablecloths together, "I was thinking about the title of my dissertation. I'm considering something about legacy preservation in family collections." I smiled at the parallel to our own family's journey. "It's about how families decide what to preserve and pass down," she continued, "and how those choices shape future generations' understanding of their heritage." "That sounds perfect," I replied, understanding that she was talking about much more than library archives. As I watched her drive away, the last to leave, I settled onto the porch swing that Edward had built decades ago. The estate that had become such a flashpoint remained largely unchanged in its monetary value. What had transformed completely was its meaning to our family, no longer just a financial inheritance, but a repository of values, a catalyst for growth, and a foundation for genuine connection across generations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.